Did you know that during Queen Victoria's reign, around half the population relied on agriculture for their livelihood? Now, if you're researching your family history, there's a really good chance you have agricultural labourers in your tree. And if you try to trace them, you'll know how difficult they can be to find. They didn't leave letters, they didn't own land, they rarely left a will, and they often moved for work. And sometimes it can feel like they simply disappear, especially before the census. But every now and then, one of them comes into focus, not through official records, but through fragments, through other people's memories, through small human details that survive almost by accident. And when that happens, you don't just find a name, you find a life. Now, this is one of those stories. John Buckman, one of my ancestors, was born in 1787 in Sussex. He spent his life in Hartfield, although he was born in Wivelsfield. Hartfield's on the edge of the Ashdown Forest. The records describe him simply as an agricultural labourer, an ag lab. But that label doesn't come close to capturing what his life was actually like. Because for people like John, survival didn't come from wages alone, it came from the land around them, and in this case, from the forest. And we see that more broadly in events like the Swing Riots of 1830. Now, these were protests by agricultural labourers, very much like John Buckman. They were reacting to low wages, rising hardship, and the introduction of threshing machines, which threatened their already fragile livelihoods. Across Sussex and Kent, labourers gathered, demanded better pay, destroyed machinery, and they even set things on fire. Some were arrested and some were even transported, and a very small handful were hung. Newspapers at the time report labourers being tried for breaking threshing machines or assembling in protest, showing just how widespread this serious unrest was. And what's striking is that this wasn't just chaos. It was organised, collective, and deeply rooted in lived experience. People pushed to the edge, trying to reclaim some control over their lives. John Buckman lived through this period. We don't know whether he was directly involved or not, but he definitely would have known about it. It was happening around him. He would have felt the pressures behind it, the low wages, the uncertainty, the tension between labourers and landowners. It was the world he lived in. Now, Ashdown Forest wasn't just a landscape, it was part of a working system that people depended on every day. Families cut turf and peat for fuel, gathered bracken for bedding, collected wood, and used the land to support a cow. This wasn't occasional, it was absolutely essential. Without it, survival became much harder. And we know this not just from the records, but from people who lived it. Martha Baker remembered cutting 9 loads of bracken with her family in a single year. And this is recorded in something called the Raper notebooks. Now, these notebooks were taken by a solicitor called Raper, who was investigating and trying to build a case to stop the enclosure of the Ashdown Forest by the landowner, the Earl Delaware. So he went round and interviewed lots of people. Martha Baker was one of these voices. A woman's voice at that time was very unusual. And this gives a real insight into her life. So she remembered cutting all these loads of bracken, and some of them were for the landlord, some for others, some for themselves. And she remembered being paid 10 shillings a load. And even what she even remembers what she bought with that money, a new frock. She remembered taking a baby onto the forest in its cradle and accidentally tipping it over. You can just imagine that. It's such a vivid human detail, but it tells you something really important. Work, family life, and survival were all happening together in the same place. Others describe the same world. John Brooker recalled going onto the forest with his father as a child, long before he was properly working. His father carried turf, peat, and litter, which is the bits of like bracken and things. And his father carried this for local people while their animals grazed there. He remembered the teams, the loads, the constant movement across the landscape. And in those memories, we find John Buckman, or Old Jack Buckman. The carter, he is described as the carter, the man bringing the team off the forest with litter. No, not someone who appears prominently in official records, but someone who was known, seen, remembered. We also have John's own account, recorded late in his life. He said he went into service at 11. And even before that, he was helping. He was loading bracken, going out with the team, learning what needed to be done. He lived on a cottage on the edge of the forest, and like everyone else around him, his family relied on it completely. They burnt peat and turf, cut scrub, turned out a cow. Everything was tied to the land. Now, this wasn't a simple or a secure life. It was skilled, physical, and precarious. And it depended on access to the land that they did not own. Because beneath all of this tension, the forest belonged to the landowner. But the people who lived around it depended on it. And over time, that tension turned into conflict. What had always been understood as part of everyday survival began to be questioned, controlled, and sometimes punished. People were prosecuted for taking wood. Even those in authority couldn't always agree on what was allowed. So people like John were living through a moment of huge change. They were commoners, literally living on the common land. This wasn't a dramatic or sudden shift, but a gradual one, where the rules of everyday life became less certain. And what makes John particularly striking is the length of his life. He was born in 1787 and died in 1873. Pause for a moment. That's extraordinary. He was born before the end of the 18th century, before railways, before large-scale industrialisation had fully reshaped the country. And he lived well into the Victorian period, when everything was beginning to change. Transport, industry, law, land use. His life spans that transition from a world where custom governed survival to one where law increasingly did. And we can see the end of his life recorded in something very simple, a burial register, a single line, his name, his age, the date he was buried. That's what remains of the official record. But the notebooks give us something more. And it's worth pausing briefly on why those notebooks exist at all. Now, they were created because of a dispute, legal arguments over rights to the forest. People called to give evidence about how the land had been used, what had always been done, who had taken what and for how long. And in answering those questions, they described their lives. They talked about cutting bracken, digging peat, grazing animals, carrying loads, working as children. They talked about ordinary things because to them, they were just explaining how life worked. But for us, those ordinary details are everything because they allow us to see people like John Buckman, not just as a label, not just as an ag lab, but as a person living within a system at a particular moment in time. And there's one small moment in these notebooks that captures that perfectly. Martha Baker, I mentioned earlier, remembered being at the Buckman's house with John's wife, Judith. And she had a thorn in her finger. Something we barely noticed today, but it became serious enough that it nearly cost her arm. Infection could spread quickly, and without antibiotics, there was no certainty of recovering. John was out working at the time, driving a team on the forest. When he heard, he stopped, left work, came in to see her, and told Martha to send for the doctor immediately. Now, it's such a small detail, but it tells you so much about the world they were living in. Life was fragile. Survival could turn on something as minor as a thorn. By the time John's story was written down, he was an old man in his 70s. His memory was beginning to fail, and he wasn't even called as a formal witness, just present in the background, his voice fading at the edges of the record. And that's often what happens with people like this. They don't leave much behind. They exist in fragments, in other people's memories, in small details, in moments that almost didn't get recorded at all. But when you bring these fragments together, something moves. Because John Buckman isn't just a name on a record, he's part of a much bigger story, a way of life built on land, labour, and custom at a moment when the world was beginning to change. Now, if you have ag labs in your family tree and it feels like you can't quite find them or you don't know much about them, don't dismiss them. It may not be because they weren't there. It may be because they live lives that weren't meant to be recorded. And every now and then, one of them comes into focus. And what you get is something rare. Not just a name, but a glimpse of how they lived. John Buckman was one of those people. But to those who knew him, he was simply Old Jack. Please follow, subscribe, visit my website to sign up for my guide to family history. And I'll be back next week with another story. But if you've got an ag lab in your tree, go off and hunt in the information around the area they were living in, because you never know, you might find your own Old Jack. Thank you.